Hello, I'm Sarah Sachs-Eldridge. I'm the national organiser of the Socialist Party. We're here today to discuss the Russian Revolution on the centenary of the October 1917 events, an event that is controversial and how it is portrayed and seen, to say the least. I'm here with Peter Taaffe. Peter is the General Secretary of the Socialist Party. Peter's recently written a new introduction to John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, which is eyewitness to the events in October. And you can read that in the new issue of Socialism Today that's just out. So the 10 Days That Shook the World has been serialised on Radio 4 this week, and there's also been a new BBC Two TV programme on the Russian Revolution. What's your opinion on the way the events that took place have been portrayed?
Well, the October/November 1917 revolution, in our opinion, was the single most important event and the greatest event in human history, when the masses of an underdeveloped country, really the India of Western Europe, oppressed by a dictatorship, subjected to exploitation by the landlords, the peasants on the land, the working class was exploited. They rose and overthrew Tsarism, a 1,000-year-old regime, and established a new workers and peasants government with democracy. And the 10 days that shook the world that John Reed spoke about was really the Russian Revolution and the effect that that had on the whole of the world. It detonated revolutions in Europe, a revolutionary situation in the neo-colonial world in China, and also, of course, in the US with an enormous radicalization. And the way that this has been dealt with on BBC, TV and radio this week, actually it's chalk and cheese. The way that the radio dealt with it, which was relatively objective in relation to John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, and the programme on BBC Two was just a hatchet job by hatchet historians, frankly, who came out with childish accusations against the revolution, against the main figures of the revolution, against the Bolsheviks, against Lenin, against Trotsky. One of these figures was Figes, who actually is known to a wide layer of academics as the man who writes his own appraisals of his own work. Nobody praises Figes more than Figes himself. And you had Simon Seabag Montefiore. He should be called Simon Windbag Montefiore, because there was nothing in what he said which bears any relationship to what happened in the Russian Revolution. We don't expect people to agree with us on the revolution, but at least have an objective appraisal of what took place and agree on certain features which we can all accept, that this was one of the greatest events in history. The TV programme was like a comic portrayal of the Bolsheviks who led the revolution and of the Russian Revolution itself. And we will propose that the organisers of these two programmes should debate with one another. And we'll join in, by the way, and we'll even set it up, if you like, at the forthcoming socialism event, and we can have a real debate which can educate working people about the reality of the Russian Revolution, which had a strong bearing on the whole of the 20th century, and also is resonating on its 100th anniversary in the 21st century as well.
So you don't see it as a coup, as they presented it in that programme?
No, that's a childish interpretation and a slander and all the other adjectives you can use against people who have no understanding of the laws of revolution. Revolution is not made by revolutionaries, by Lenin and by Trotsky. Revolution develops objectively when the old society can no longer find a new way of taking society forward. That happened under the bourgeois revolutions of Britain, of England, in the 17th century, of the French Revolution, which I wrote a book on. It was a bourgeois revolution, but it arose because of the contradictions, if you like, and because of the remnants of feudalism in an increasingly capitalist society. So also, all the elements of the new society, as Marx pointed out, had developed under capitalism, where you had, on the one side, social production by the working class organised in big industry, developing a social product, but it was appropriated, the wealth was appropriated through that labour by individuals, and that contradiction produced crises, it produced the upheavals of the Russian Revolution, where the revolutionaries came in, like Lenin, Trotsky and the Bolsheviks, was to understand the laws of revolution, base themselves upon that, particularly on the working class, arm them with the programme which is derived from the experience of the working class, and gave back to them, in the course of the revolution over 9 months, gave back to them the slogans that could push the revolution forward at each stage. And actually, if you read John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, it's incontrovertible that the Bolsheviks got a majority in the workers' and peasants' councils and the soldiers' councils, and only took power when they had the majority. There was a premature uprising in July. It was before the working class had drawn all the necessary conclusions, and for that reason, Lenin and Trotsky opposed the uprising then in July, because they wanted the soldiers at the front to get experience of the war and to see the only way out was to create their own government and their own power. And that took place particularly after the attempted coup of Kornilov in August 1917, which pushed the majority of the working class, of the peasants and of the soldiers to support the idea of a new power based upon a Congress of the Soviets. It's childish to think you can convince people, either then or today, by tricks, by intrigues, by a coup. It's not possible. You have to win the majority in the course of the movement itself.
I want to pick up on a number of the things that you've said. I mean, one word that you used was premature, and that is one of the things that's said about the Russian Revolution. Because it was such an economically undeveloped country, was it a premature to go for a revolution, from the Bolsheviks' point of view?
No, it wasn't premature, because Russia was ready for revolution because of a number of factors. It wasn't the ideal situation, if you like, according to the schema of Marx and of Engels. The revolution, or the socialist revolution to be more precise, usually was envisaged as taking place in the most developed capitalist society, where industry had developed to its maximum, where the working class was a majority. But the peculiarity of the Russian Revolution is capitalism broke at its weakest link. That's crucial in understanding what took place in Russia. And the peculiar features and special features of the Russian Revolution is, by the beginning of the First World War, the whole of the world was ready for a revolution to overthrow capitalism and establish a new socialist regime. But in Russia you had special factors, and that was the majority of the population were peasants, it was true, so it wasn't, if you like, an isolation. You couldn't create socialism, but you could break capitalism at its weakest link. The working class was small, relatively speaking, but very dynamic, with revolutionary traditions inherited from 1905, then the second revolution of February 1917 with a certain ideological confusion, when the Bolsheviks only had 8,000 members, when the propaganda against the Bolsheviks was such that the sailors, the revolutionary sailors, were prepared to bayonet Lenin on his return to Russia because they believed he was a German agent, which of course was concocted by the ruling class and by the newspapers and so on. So you had amongst the working class this very dynamic, small working class concentrated in big industry, put forward a programme that was able to win the majority of the population, particularly the peasants. And in 10 Days That Shook the World, John Reed gives a very good example of the way that the peasants went to the leaders of the whites, the counter-revolution, if you like. One of the leaders was Kaledin, and he asked the leaders of the whites, are you prepared? And by the way, this was the Cossacks. They went to Kaledin and said, are you prepared to give the big landed estates of the landlords over to the peasants, the ordinary peasant Cossacks? He said, on no account. They went to Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks and said, are you prepared to give the land to the peasants? And the reply of Lenin and Trotsky, would you be prepared to give the land to the peasants? And they said, no, you take the land and we will ratify that in law. And that's what happened. So an unbreakable link developed between the working class in the cities and between the peasant masses in the countryside, crowned by the decision of the Congress of Soviets, and that unleashed the 10 days that shook the world. But Russia was not ready for socialism in the abstract, if you like. It could break at its weakest link. Capitalism could break at its weakest link. But the idea of Lenin, of Trotsky, of the Bolsheviks was to create then a chain of revolutions in Germany, which happened, in Hungary, a revolutionary situation in the rest of Europe, revolutionary echoes of this in the US even, and of course the Chinese Revolution of 1925-27. If that would have succeeded, then really it wouldn't have been 10 days, it would have been like 100 days that shook the world, and a new socialist order could have been created.
One of the things that came across in the BBC programme, and you said what you think about it already, which I would agree with, but is the huge attack on Lenin as an individual, almost claiming that he took power in his own personal interest, almost, I would say, even making comparisons with, or making him into a Trump-like figure. What do you think about all of that?
Well, it's nonsense because, and it's proved to be nonsense by the facts. There are very few, if any, people in history who were more concerned about personal power than Lenin. In fact, there's many occasions when Lenin and Trotsky said how trivial to want power for the sake of power. They wanted the working class to have power independently through their own organizations, through the Soviets, as I said, through workers' councils, in alliance with the peasants' councils and the soldiers' councils and so on. But in that, to stop the rise of personal power, election of all officials, right of recall of those officials, not like we have in Britain, a parliament elected every 5 years. Theresa May now is enormously unpopular, but what's the mechanism for replacing Theresa May? Why not have the right of recall, which existed in Russia? No MP or official in the Soviets should receive more than the average wage of a skilled worker. If you're going to pay for special talents, no more than 4 to 1, not the 350 to 1 that we have in Britain, or even Jeremy Corbyn's proposals of 20 to 1, which is far too much to reward the best talent and the skilled workers. All of those existed, and the right for all parties to participate in the Soviets and fight for a majority. And the idea that Lenin and Trotsky then established a dictatorial regime is bunkum and is belied by the facts for anybody who objectively looks at what happened. The only parties that were legalised was the equivalent of the fascists here. The Black Hundreds, the neo-fascists if you like, they were legalised because why should we allow them to use democracy in order to subvert democracy and to create a dictatorship? The Mensheviks were allowed to participate, the social revolutionaries and so on. And only when they took up arms, like for instance Kerensky did, after he lost the power, took up arms, then were the Bolsheviks forced to fight. All this nonsense about the Red Terror, yes there was, but it was provoked by the White Terror that created immeasurable victims in Russia. And at one stage, with the parts of the country were reduced to cannibalism. It's amazing the way the resilience of the Russian workers and the first worker state in history, the way that they managed to maintain themselves.
And I think one of the things that people don't necessarily know by the way Lenin is presented is how much he fought for the party as well. That it was like in no way just about himself, but he was trying to develop a party. I mean, why do you think that is important?
Well, this is a very good question, Sarah, because it goes to the heart of the relevance of the Russian Revolution today in relation to the task that socialists have in the modern era. Because it's not the last revolution. We had a revolution in Germany in 1919. We had another version of the revolution, or a revolutionary attempt, in 1923. We had the 25-27 revolution in China. We had the Spanish Revolution, a marvellous event between 1931 and 1937. And there was a difference between the Spanish Revolution and, for instance, the Russian Revolution, and that was the absence of a war in Spain, because the war enormously speeded up the revolution. What was the use of bread if you lost your life in the trenches of the First World War? So the war enormously speeded up the Russian Revolution, but the Spanish Revolution developed over something like 7 years and was opportunities to take power. We have Bernie Sanders in the US today who's talked about revolution. Revolution is now on the agenda. A correct point was made by Jeremy Corbyn in his speech. By the way, we made the point much earlier that the crisis of 2007, 2008, that will be reflected in political developments at a certain stage. And it has been in the phenomenon of Corbynism, in Bernie Sanders in the US, in Mélenchon in France, and so on. And it will be a pattern. And there are going to be revolutionary upheavals. There is already an element of revolution in the colossal change in the consciousness, the political outlook of the working class. In Britain, only 15% of the youth actually in polls now say they support the Tories. What does that indicate? That's a revolution in consciousness. So you're going to have, irrespective of us, mass movements taking place where the working class will reach out for the power. No question of going back to Stalinism. It's not possible. On the basis of an advanced industrial society, all this stuff with the Daily Telegraph and the Mail, a warning about Corbyn recreating the chaos of the neo-colonial world, of what happened in Venezuela and so on. No, we have a very highly developed society today with an advanced working class, an educated working class, and they will not allow a greedy dictator or a dictatorial party to usurp the power and have that personal power for themselves. And that's the music really of the future. But there have been many revolutions in history. The ones I've given, but closer to home, 1968 in France, when 10 million workers occupied the factories. In Portugal, in 1974, 1973, 1974, when the working class, in reaction to a coup of Spinola, very much like the working class reacted in Russia to the Kornilov coup. So you see there, the laws of revolution that are played out, gave an enormous push to the movement, forced the government in Portugal to take over 70% of industry, and the Times newspaper said capitalism is dead in Portugal. Well, it wasn't. It was almost dead. But what you needed was a party, like the Socialist Party, formerly the militant, of a mass proportions to show what was necessary in order to consolidate that power and to spread the movement to the whole of Europe and to the whole of the world for that matter. That's why a party like the Socialist Party is absolutely critical. We don't exaggerate our force today. We are the party in the form of the militant that defeated Margaret Thatcher in Liverpool, and defeated her twice, by the way, not just in Liverpool between 1983 and 1987, but also in the epic poll tax battle when 34 of our comrades were jailed for refusing to organise the poll tax. And what was the result of that? A mass movement where 18 million people refused to pay the tax. And that's what brought down Thatcher. That and her position on Europe brought down the Thatcher government at that stage. Now, we've had since then reaction. We've had neoliberalism. We've had a retreat in the consciousness of the working class, but now that's all gone. The crisis of capitalism is having a political effect on the outlook of the working class. Of course, the working class has to relearn, and particularly the youth, many of the lessons from the past, but nevertheless they are learning in this tremendous movement that's taking place. And that's the relevance of the Russian Revolution. Revolutions are not made by revolutionaries, I repeat. They are a product of the contradictions of capitalism. They result, whether we were there or not, in mass movements. The question is, will those mass movements be utilised by winning a majority amongst the working class for the idea of breaking the link once more of capitalism and then appealing to our brothers and sisters in Europe and in the rest of the world to create a new democratic socialist world federation?
I think that's absolutely right, and we are definitely encountering a big interest in socialist ideas, in revolution and so on. But I think the BBC and the capitalist establishment will probably think they've got a trump card in attacking those ideas by saying it laid the basis for Stalinism. down the road of revolution comes dictatorship, down the road of revolution comes Stalinism. How would you answer that?
Well, of course, I think that is nonsense, because why is it that when Stalin, I mean, this programme on the BBC Two pictured that Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin were the leaders of the Russian Revolution. Nothing could be further from the truth. No serious bourgeois historian would make a claim of that character. Stalin played no major role in the February Revolution, except he played a bad role when he argued for a coalition with the Mensheviks, when Lenin in Zurich and Trotsky in New York both agreed, without consulting one another, said this is the beginning of the Socialist Revolution, not just in Russia, but throughout the world. Stalin was a minor figure. He was a minor figure in the days of October, November 1917, when the real leadership of the insurrection, of the uprising, was Trotsky, of course, with the enormous influence with Lenin and Trotsky as the joint leaders of the Russian Revolution. Why is it that if Stalin was a product of Leninism or a product of Bolshevism, why did Stalin wipe out the Bolshevik Party, which made the revolution? And the very simple explanation is a counter-revolution had taken place, a political counter-revolution on the foundations of the Russian Revolution, because of the isolation of the revolution itself. The idea, I repeat, was to spread the revolution to Europe and the world. That was defeated by the rotten policies of the social democratic leaders. That produced a beleaguered fortress in Russia. Russia itself was not ready for a developed socialism. It was an underdeveloped country, as you pointed out. And therefore, in an underdeveloped country, you need somebody to make sure people stand in line to queue for scarce goods. That man or woman who makes you stand in line makes sure they eat first and eat best. That was the origins of the bureaucracy. They found somebody inside the Bolshevik Party, like Stalin, with the authority of Bolshevism, but with an entirely different empirical approach. And Stalin himself concentrated personal power in his hands because of this isolation of the Russian Revolution, but then that had the momentum of its own. A bureaucracy developed that to begin with made mistakes. It wasn't conscious mistakes, but developed then into a bureaucratic stratum that then had interests separate and apart from the idea of spreading the revolution, with the theory of socialism in one country that nobody in the Bolshevik Party accepted at the outset. That was a kind of theoretical summing up of the interests of a growing bureaucratic stratum which clashed with the original socialist, working class and international aims of the Russian Revolution itself. So Stalinism was not an outgrowth of Bolshevism, it was a negation of Bolshevism, a negation of genuine Marxism. We have many examples of this in history, and that's why Stalinist regimes existed in isolation, one-party totalitarian that had nothing in common with the genuine democratic ideas of Marx and Engels, of Lenin and of Trotsky. And moreover, objectively, it will not be possible, especially in the so-called advanced industrial countries, to have a regime like Stalinism of that character. If one country breaks with capitalism, that will be enough to spread the revolution, a new 10 days that shook the world throughout Europe and throughout the world. And it will be on the basis of workers' democracy, full freedom. The only party that could be legalised, that depends on how strong they are, will be the fascists, neo-fascists and so on. We'd be very much in favour of Theresa May having the right to exist in that situation. And she could have a paper the size of the Socialist and go out to Leytonstone Station here and try and sell her paper. Let's return back to capitalism, unemployment, poverty and all the rest of it. And we would be in a society then that would be arguing for progress, for developing an enormous talents of people and particularly of young people.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. I think that has been a very good discussion on the Russian Revolution. on this centenary. If you've enjoyed it or if you've got questions, we hope that you will comment below the video, but particularly, like Peter mentioned earlier, we are hosting Socialism 2017 on the 11th and 12th of November at the Institute of Education in London. It is a weekend of discussion and debate, and there will be 1,000 young people, students, trade unionists, workers, anti-cuts campaigners participating, and we will be talking about all the aspects of the Russian Revolution that Peter has discussed, the situation with Jeremy Corbyn. How can we make Corbyn's policies real now? How do we fight for the free education that was put forward in the general election, the £10 an hour, the rent control, the things that we need to fight for right now? And as Peter mentioned, we have also put out an invite. We have sent a specific invite to Simon Sebag Montefiore, to Robert Service, to Orlando Figures, these people who are given a platform on the BBC. By the way, I'm not sure why you weren't on the BBC programme, but we know how they've treated Jeremy Corbyn and socialists through the years. So please come along. You can get tickets at www.socialism2017.net. All the information is there about the meetings, the speakers and everything, and we hope to see you there.